If the study of literature is to be of any success, we must be honest about our object. But how are we to do this when faced with literature that so directly assails our principles of comfortability, of acceptability, of tolerability? In other words, how are we to deal with transgressive literature? Regardless of who you are, we all have those literary works that we read, and they transgress in some way, and therefore create in us a sense of strife. More importantly, it brings a critical question to the fore, which is, how are we to read such literature? For surely it can be admitted that such works bring a number of problems with them. The very intolerability that they bring with them makes them more difficult to read and more difficult to appraise, precisely because the moralisms and the obstinacy of our value systems can get in the way of us being able to appreciate the literary object for what it is. And indeed, when we get to this point, I think it's effective to consider literature as a proxy. This is a sort of theory of literature that I've been developing over the last few years, and it's really come to the forefront of how do I try to approach literary texts. This obviously applies to our pertinent object here of transgressive texts, but it could apply to all texts. This is a mix of an affectively open readerly experience and a descriptive literary project. It is both free and personal and also technical and scholarly, and I think that it can be really helpful for understanding the world and the dwelling that literature creates and profers for us, allowing for us to take in all of its mannerisms and modes, all of its frameworks and permutations, and treat them as being able to yield something. Now, exactly what that something is will depend upon the work, but I think that we are far too unwilling to take certain pieces of literature seriously, and in fact not to consider them literature at all. But if we take away the obstinacy of the moralisms implicit in this resistance, we would find a much wider array of possible literatures that we could appraise and appreciate. At the forefront of this conception of literature as proxy is the demand that literature should be something that we encounter. We should encounter it emotionally, personally, existentially, philosophically, conceptually, narratologically. We should investigate it not as some object foreign to us, but as something which implicates us and in which we reside when we participate in the act of readerly experience. As such, the theory of literature as proxy states that literature is a proxy by which we experience things we may not want to experience. It allows us to inhabit the literary object and the artifact, imbuing it with life that comes from our subjective experience and from a descriptive analysis of all the traits of the text. Therefore, this always needs to start by asking a text what questions it is asking. For at the forefront of this concept of literature is that it is an open artifact, asking and opening more than it is answering and forestalling. And the trajectory of the questions matters more than the point of the answers. It's the momentum in the question that carries us forward, that beckons that we continue to read the literary work. Think of this, right? You've had certain pieces of literature that you read, and they're a page-turner. You feel compelled to read them, whereas others shut you off. And more often than not, this shutting off is a moralistic response, not simply a question of ability. Oftentimes, we have the capacity to read this work, but for some reason, we feel that we can't. The question here is to consider the momentum of the literary work as valuable in itself and something worth pursuing, whether or not we morally agree with the implications of that trajectory, of where it's going, of the point we imagine that it is positing. Instead, I ask not that we sidestep or obfuscate these points, but consider instead the openness of this trajectory of the question. The fact that the question comes with open arms and beckons us inward. It invites us into a space that we inhabit and investigate the consequences of. The literary experience is therefore one of affirmation, acceptance, and openness to the other. To the other that is preferred within the work, and also the other in our lives, which are not even necessarily implicated or indexed in the work. It is a practice in radical openness, in the practice of accepting that which is at the limits of toleration. It is a sort of cosmopolitan, democratic opening up of our limitations. Important here is the idea that impelled and oppressed as we may be bodily, the imagination is free. The imagination is a space where anything goes. And shame and moralism have no place in the imagination and in the appraisal and enjoyment of literature. In literature, it can be morally abhorrent, it can be factually wrong, it can be ideologically regressive, it can be religiously heretical, and yet still be good literature, still be good art. Something can be obscene, absurd, counterproductive, confusing, and yet that in itself can be valuable. The value of facing obscenity or absurdity, for is life not often obscene or absurd? On this model, reading and the ensuing response should be both an affective openness and honesty with oneself about what one feels and observes, and on the other hand, a descriptive task of why one feels and observes the way one does. So on the one hand, affectively, we are being receptive to whatever experience will be incited in us as we participate with the text in the act of reading. And the goal, importantly, is to go beyond the moralism of this is good or bad art, or I like or dislike this. We want to ask the question, why are we being compelled to think that way? What are the preconditions in the literary artifice that allow us to come to the conclusions we do? And furthermore, speaking extra-literarily, what are the cultural structures in our life? What are the ideological structures, the religious structures in our lives that precondition our response and that allow for certain readings to be deemed acceptable or plausible and certain others not? So this is both a receptiveness affectively, but it spills over into a descriptive task, where we are not trying to be impartial, but we are trying to tabulate honestly what it is that is being incited in the literary experience. What is the very essence of reading? Well, it is response. Reading is a response to a textual artifact which, because it is open, indeterminate, and fragmentary, it has the possibility to yield a different meaning to one person as to another. And therefore we can interface with it affectively, and we can come to our own decisions about it. And by treating literature as proxy like this, reading becomes at once a personal, emotive, depth-filled experience, and on the other hand, something that we can theorize about by talking about the interplay between the artifact and the reader. And in particular, we can get beyond the obstinate moralisms that restrict otherwise good authors from being read. People like Thomas Pynchon, William Burroughs, Henry Miller. People that are often seen as obscene or pornographic or absurd. We cut past the rhetorical weight of these terms and we say, okay, even if it is the case that they are obscene, absurd, pornographic, what is the actual content of those words? What does that actually mean when we look at the literary artifice? For it has often been contentiously defined legally what exactly obscenity is. And you can see my video on the Naked Lunch trial, where pornography and therefore obscenity are very loosely defined. In fact, it's more of a you know it when you see it kind of thing. This is where the very phrase came from, this trial. So the fact that these words are not very well defined shows that if we really want to take those words seriously, we at least have to delve into the literature that those words would seem to forestall, to prohibit. And to do so allows one to appreciate a wider array of literature, appreciating it for what it is and what it could be, what we could make it into be, what it could become in the future. And we can also become more aware of what one does not like about it. You can put your finger on not, oh, it says something that I disagree with, but oh, I can stretch forth the consequences of that. Put it in the larger context of the work, put it in the larger context of the social structures around me, and I can create a larger picture, a larger framework for what exactly is the function of this literary artifact. Important to consider for people curious to implement this theory of literature as proxy is that this is an art, on the one hand, of asking questions, ones that have been oftentimes proffered by the text and which we must be receptive to, and then a vicarious experimentation with frameworks and worldviews which have been proffered and which, like a dwelling, open up and invite one in to, in the imagination, do whatever one likes. Anything you want. Because it's you. And because literary experience and interpretation and meaning are subjective. They depend upon the fact that you've got to do stuff in your imagination. And one should have some kind of guidelines in mind, which is that reading should be intelligent. It should be thoughtful. It should be conscientious. Conscientious of the elements in play, of the structures that are preconditioning those elements. It should be honest, so we should not be skittish or squeamish. It should be both indulgent and receptive, and skeptical and critical simultaneously. So this is a difficult practice to put into place, precisely because it depends upon the work and the person. But that is the beauty of it, is it gives us a sort of liminal, basic framework for how to approach literary artifices in the most open way possible, to analyze their structures and their architecture and allow it, like a skeleton, to become the framework for some larger body of knowledge and theory. That being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been stimulating and interesting. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it really helps me out. I appreciate everyone who donates. That being said, that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.